see Stacy. I see Stacy Clayton is on as well. She's part of our team. So I would say at any point, Stacy, if you want to jump in, feel free to jump in and provide some of your own insights as well. I do have a PowerPoint presentation that I will use to sort of guide us through the conversation. I thought what I would start to do, as Brenna said, is sort of provide a foundation before we talk about advocating before the legislature, and just put everyone on the same ground of sort of how is the legislature set up in Michigan, how is it similar or dissimilar to federal government, which I feel like more people are familiar with, and then some of the nuances within the legislature between both chambers. And then I picked out a few pieces of legislation that I thought were unique in that they're not typical pieces of legislation that move through the legislature, and that they have something tied to them, either a tie bar or some specific appropriation or some other conditional effective date. That is stuff you don't always see in legislation. And one of those bills actually is tied to a program that Wayne State is involved in. So I thought that was fitting as well. I will jump into the presentation, and I do not know how to present. So I will try to figure this out. What does everyone see? The full presentation or the 3 slides?
I think we are looking at your presenter view right now in PowerPoint.
Okay. Maybe I will I will save it as give me 1 second. I'm going to save it as a PDF and then just present the PDF, because I don't know how to do this in Zoom.
Sure.
I'm assuming everyone can see the PDF now.
Yes. Yep. We can see your first slide.
All right. So this overview, the 3 branches of government, again, showing it's fairly similar to the federal government. I think everyone is aware of the federal government's organizational setup. You have sort of your 3 branches of government. You have your legislative branch, your executive branch, and your judicial branch. Again, similar in Michigan, we have a bicameral legislature, which means we have a House and Senate. Some states have a unicameral legislature, where they only have one body that does the lawmaking for the state. Michigan is different from Congress in that we have less rules tied around which chamber a bill has to originate in, or sort of the process as a bill goes through the chamber for enactment into law. So Michigan is much more lenient in that way. Again, Congress has additional rules and timing and sort of procedures in place that make it more difficult for legislation to pass, where in the legislature, in Michigan, it's much more straightforward. The setup of the legislature in Michigan, the House of Representatives has 110 members. The Senate has 38 members. The term limits are 2 years in the House, 4 years in the Senate. The term limit, there's an asterisk there. It used to be you could serve 3 terms in the House for 6 years and 2 terms in the Senate for 8 years. That changed with the passage of proposal 2022-1, which is in the most recent election. It will now allow legislators to serve for 12 years, but there are some caveats to that. So if you were running for the Senate this term, you're allowed to still serve 2 terms in the Senate next term. So you will go to the traditional 14 years. There's also some issues on clarity of what happens with those people that ran for the Senate that had those 2 terms that lost, if they'll be subject to the new 12-year requirement, or they'll still be able to serve 2 terms in the Senate if they seek election in the upcoming election down the road. Overview, what is the legislature? So the legislature, it's set up with, you have obviously your 138 legislators, 30 in the Senate, 110 in the House. You have your leadership. In the House, that is the Speaker. In the Senate, that's the Senate Majority Leader. And then you have other leadership positions trickling down. You have staff that both work either for caucuses, work for individual members, work for leadership, or work for the nonpartisan offices. And then you have committee staff, which are generally the clerk's office. The Senate used to have committee staff of their own, but that is sort of moved fully to the clerk's office. And then the powers of the legislature, again, they do the lawmaking, they do the appropriations, the budgeting for the state, they do oversight over other departments, and they do constituent representation, are the four big things that your legislators will do. How is the legislature organized? This is an overview of the setup of the legislature. The dotted lines represent members that serve on those committees. So looking at the top, the Michigan State Capitol Commission, that is the commission that oversees the state capitol building and activities that happen within that building, and that's headed up by the clerk of the House and the secretary of the Senate. The clerk of the House is voted on by the members of the House to be the clerk, and the secretary of the Senate is voted on by members of the Senate to be the secretary. So with a note here is with the changing of leadership in both in the House and Senate, the first time in 40 years for the Senate, they will have an election where likely the secretary of the Senate will change to someone that is appointed by the Democrats. Same in the House. A note is that the assistant secretary and the assistant clerk is from the other party. So generally now with party switching, it'll just be the assistant will now be in charge. Legislative council is the independent council that serves the legislature. So what they do is they do all the research for the legislators. They do all the actual bill drafting. They house the ombudsman's offices. And they sort of manage many of the commissions and committees that are separate from the legislature. And that dotted line is that both the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader serve as the chairs of the Legislative Council. And then the leadership within the Legislative Council is appointed by the Speaker and Majority Leader. As you see, it's similar for both the Speaker and Majority Leader on sort of how their staffing works, but essentially your largest positions are Floor Leader and Speaker Pro Tem and President Pro Tem. The President Pro Tem and Speaker Pro Tem are generally the people you'll see up at the rostrum doing the business of the day. The Floor Leader is the person who will make sure the business of the floor sort of goes in a smooth manner and does all the procedural work that happens to have a bill move through the process. And then below that, you obviously have your caucuses and then your whips that make sure bills have the votes to move, and then your staff. And I would just note at the bottom here, you have the fiscal agencies and the business offices. Those are both two nonpartisan independent agencies that report sort of directly up through the Speaker and Majority Leader to serve the legislature. And they serve both caucuses, majority and minority, for every bill or issue that sort of arises within the legislature. And then off to the side is the President of the Senate. That's the Lieutenant Governor. They are sort of separate, but they head up the Senate, and similar to Congress, the President of the Senate is the tie-breaking vote if there is a tie in the Senate. Sort of already went over this, so I'll skip to the next slide. Sort of how does each chamber carry out their functions? I can send this PowerPoint to Brenna after, and then you guys, because there are some links in here. So if you click on this, you'll be able to go to the House, Senate, and Joint Rules. And what this does is each chamber develops their own rules, which then results in how does a bill sort of get referred to a committee? What committees are established? What do sort of the rules for the floor entail? So to give you two sort of really simple examples, the House and Senate have different procedural rules when voting on bills. So in the Senate, they have something colloquially known as the shot clock. So every time a bill is up on the board to be voted on, they have, 1 minute and 30 seconds to vote on that bill, and every member has to vote. And then every amendment that is before the board has to be voted on as a record roll call vote to be either adopted or rejected. On the House, their rules do not have a sort of shot clock because you have 110 members, and generally they will leave bills up on the board for extended periods of time if they don't have the votes for a bill. So if you ever watch session You'll see the Senate, things move very quickly as they go through, but on the House side, you will see a bill up and they may be nothing happening for 10, 20, 30 minutes in which people are discussing the bill, having a conversation on getting members to get to a yes or a no on the bill, depending on, what the outcome the leaders want the outcome for that bill. Then you'll also notice in the House, they do not have to vote on amendments. They are gavelled on and off by whoever's up at the rostrum, normally the Speaker pro tem. So you will see, I think if you Google historically, there's been an issue where every bill in the House is given immediate effect without a record roll call vote, which is upset the minority party from time to time. And that's because they don't actually have to have a roll call vote to see if there is the votes there for that, where in the Senate they do. So that's just sort of one example of how the different chamber rules impact the procedure and the process when legislation is moving through the chambers. Again, here is just a little bit more information on sort of what kind of things the rules address. Other things like floor access, what staff can or can't be on the floor. This is an interesting one in the Senate. Every senator is allowed one staff person to have access to the floor that they can have with them at all times. So when they're voting on bills, they'll have a staff person that can advise them or counsel them on a bill or be part of those conversations. On the House side, you are not allowed, member staff are not allowed on the floor unless you are in a certain office that requires you to be on the floor. So the majority floor leader has multiple staff on the floor. The Speaker has multiple staff on the floor. And then generally your caucus staff will be allowed access to the floor, but not member staff. Committees, again, are sort of set up by rule, and you have your standing committees, which includes appropriations, and then subcommittees. So your standing committees are things like the Tax Policy Committee, the Government Operations Committee, the Municipal Finance and Local Government Committee, those kinds of things. And those are generally historically have always been around. They change from time to time based on leadership. So to give insight, or one example is with Democrats taking control in the House, they are now actually looking at creating a committee on housing to address housing issues within the state. And that is, I think, a first in its history. So there are times in which they change the committee structure, but you do sort of have some committees that are traditionally always around. And then the subcommittees is really an appropriations function. So you'll have your overall appropriations committee, which is your largest committee in both chambers. And then you'll have subcommittees that address specific budgets. So you will have a subcommittee, on the corrections budget, which deals with the Department of Corrections and all of its prisons throughout the state. You will have a DHHS subcommittee that deals with that department and all things related to health and human services. You'll have a LARA subcommittee that deals with all things licensing and regulatory affairs in the state. So those are those subcommittees. In your select committees or statutory committees are committees that come up from time to time. So a select committee can be created by either chamber or both to address a specific issue. There was a select committee on auto no-fault reform last term to address fixing or changing the statutes on auto no-fault. They created a specific committee that was their only focus. And then a statutory committee is what its name says, is it's something that's established by statute that is required to be there. And generally those are time limited in sort of their function. I'm just going to skip over this slide, not that important, I think, for the conversation. So what is lawmaking for the legislatures? They enact, amend, and repeal laws. They propose constitutional amendments, and then they do policy, business, and commemorative resolutions. So I think what most people are probably interested in is the enacting, amending, and repealing laws. I think that's what most people think of when they think of the legislature. And that is sort of the day-to-day business of what they are doing. Constitutional amendments are rare and few and far between, but you will see, I can show you at the end of this presentation when I have some other links how to go through the legislative website, and you can see every joint resolution or constitutional amendment that they offer throughout the term. There are quite a bit, but oftentimes they don't move. It's more sort of just something that is more of a policy or PR things for both caucuses generally. And then the resolutions is another item that is generally, I would say, more PR related, in that there is no real business, nothing really goes into effect, but they are things that members do either for constituents in their district, for issues they care about, or issues that they know they will not see a bill move on, but they would like to make a sort of political statement or point on to, sort of let their position be known. So what is the lawmaking process? Again, this is where Michigan's a little different from Congress in that it's a much more free-flowing, I guess, process, in that there aren't as many rules into how it starts, but like anything, you have to start with an idea. And I think, we've talked to Brenna and Cy Paul before about sort of working with this group to then develop policy ideas and sort of work through that process. So part one is a legislator has a new idea. Sometimes that's an idea they come up with. Sometimes that's an idea that a stakeholder brings to them. And so as they have an idea, you then work with that independent counsel, which is the legislative council, and the Legislative Service Bureau, which does the bill drafting to develop the bill. And when you work with them, they are the experts in state statute and they are subject matter experts. So you'll work with them to say, does this need a new act? Do we amend an existing act? Is it best to amend an existing act and create a new act for some other piece of this? Do we need to go into multiple different acts to, develop this? So that's sort of what that service is for. Once you have a draft of the bill, you feel like it's been vetted, you then will introduce the bill, and the bill is then referred to committee. And that process is really a process of, while it says the speaker and majority leader decide, it's really a process of the staff. So this is important to, one, have a good sponsor that will work with staff that refer the bills to committee, and two, to think about where you want a bill to go. So if you're working with a legislator and you have a bill that is, say, mental health related, which is an example later on, is that something you want to go to a policy committee on health policy, or do you want it to go to the Appropriations Committee because eventually you want funding tied to this mental health bill? And if you have a sponsor that is willing to engage with you on the issue, you then have the opportunity to say, I think this is a better committee for us because there is sort of a second piece to this. And then they will advocate for where the bill is sort of referred to committee. Then the committee process, there isn't a requirement that a bill must have a hearing or that a bill must even be referred to a committee. There are ways within the rules where you can refer a bill directly to the floor, or once a bill is referred to committee, it doesn't mean it ever needs to be taken up for testimony. But if a bill is brought up at a committee hearing, there are rules that it needs to be posted 16 hours before any bill is heard, which then allows stakeholders, the public, and other interest groups to engage on a bill and then hear testimony. Generally, the House and Senate are different in that the Senate will do one hearing where they'll have the hearing and refer the bill to the floor for vote. The Senate will generally do a 2-hearing process in which they do sort of an informational hearing on the bill. Then they will do a second hearing to either amend the bill or refer the bill to the floor if the bill is going to move forward. Then the bill will get to the floor. And generally how this works is every Friday, the speaker or the SML and the majority floor leader from each chamber will get together with staff and figure out what is the agenda for the week. So every bill that is referred from a committee is then put on the agenda, and they will go through and pick which bills will be up for that week. And then that list will go out to all legislators and staff Friday evenings normally, to which then you'll have your next session day on a Tuesday. And generally the way it works is from Friday to Tuesday, members are supposed to review the bills, review the analyses they receive from staff, read the fiscal notes, and have questions prepared for their chamber caucuses on Tuesday. They will then go in, caucus on the bills, which is a conversation. Most bills go without any conversation. Some bills will have controversy in their conversation. And then the bills will then be up for a vote on the floor. And that is generally, it's a process where it has to go to second reading where they technically read the bill on the floor. for the public to hear. They don't actually read the bill. They just read it by its title, and then it moves to third reading or final general orders, and then the bill is voted on. If there are no changes to the bill in either chamber, it goes to the governor. If either chamber changes the bill as it goes back and forth, it continues to go back and forth until they reconcile the bill and there's one version of the bill that they both agreed on. Or it can go to conference committee. Conference committee is mostly only used for appropriations bills. Generally, a bill will be reconciled between the chambers and then go to the governor. And then in Michigan, the governor has 14 days to consider a bill once it gets to his or her desk. In Michigan, the actual constitutional provision says it's down to the day, the hour, and the minute. So that is important for bills that are controversial, that the governor may want to sign or not sign or veto, that there is a time limit that is very specific. Michigan does have a pocket veto at the end of a term. So if you do not have 14 days of session left before the end of the term, and the governor does not sign a bill, it is vetoed and does not become law. If there are 14 session days left in a term and the governor does not sign the bill, it becomes law. And then if a bill is vetoed, it comes back to the chambers and they can override a veto by a 2/3 vote. Generally, that never happens because it'll require both parties to agree, and most likely a party is not going to go against the governor, or historically, if the minority party now with the governor, they want to go against her. So they normally just get referred back to committee and die for the term. Appropriations is the other big part of the budget, or a big part of the legislature. They have an annual budget bill, which is each department has a budget. And then within that budget, there is sort of it's called a part 1 and part 2. And when I pull up a bill later, I'll show you part 1 is all of the financial aspects of the budget bill. So it's the dollars. And part 2 is the boilerplate or the strings attached to those dollars. And that is your annual budget has to be completed once every year by September 30th. Interestingly, in Michigan, we do have to have a balanced budget, but there is no provision that the state has to pass a budget. There is a constitutional provision that the governor has to present his or her recommended budget by, it's like the second week in February generally. But after that, there's nothing else. So in theory, there is no requirement that they have to pass a budget, and they could do a government shutdown via not passing a budget, although unlikely. Then you have supplemental budgets, which are additional budget bills that get passed throughout the year. There are two kinds of supplemental budget bills. You have your sort of pro forma that are, as revenues change and estimates come in, you will then adjust budgets and make adjustments within the budget or transfer items between departments. And then there are sort of supplemental budgets that are policy-based in nature. So most recently, if you followed the legislature right before the election, passed a roughly $1 billion supplemental budget for economic development projects that was passed, I think, on the Wednesday, and then the Thursday, the governor announced 4 new projects, economic development projects coming to the state, where it was sort of a single item budget for one specific reason that had policy tied to it. And then a legislative transfer is, again, sort of a process within state government that the governor's office through the state budget office will send letters to the legislature asking them to allow them to transfer money between different line items within the budget so that they can continue their regular operations. And there are 2 kinds of legislative transfers. There are ones that if the legislature doesn't respond, it automatically happens. And then there are others where the legislature has to respond, otherwise it doesn't happen. And later on, I have an example of that. So next is the appropriations timeline. So I think if anyone follows the budget or the sort of financial state of the state, everyone hears the state has $7 billion in revenue that it hasn't spent. The state doesn't actually have $7 billion of revenue it hasn't spent. They are estimating that the state will have $7 billion in additional revenue above its baseline by the time we get to September 30th of 2023. And so that's this first part here in January. They have the consensus revenue estimating conference. That is when the Senate fiscal agency, the House fiscal agency, and an independent economist come together and project what they think state revenues will be for the upcoming year. And then they do those meetings regularly to adjust revenue estimates. And so the first one will come out in January. And then that is what the governor will sort of build their budget recommendation off of. And at the same time, the governor will do their state of the state, which normally includes budget recommendations. Then in February, the governor has to deliver her budget to the legislature for consideration. And then you have from March to June, in which the legislature will review the governor's budget and develop their own budget. So both the House and Senate will each develop their own budgets for consideration. Those will be voted on. So they will work at, as we talked about earlier, they'll have subcommittee budgets. So the subcommittee on DHHS will develop a DHHS budget. It will then be voted on by the subcommittee, will then come to the full appropriations committee, will be voted on by the full appropriations committee. Then it will go to the floor and it will be voted on by the full chamber. So each chamber does that, the House and the Senate, they switch the bills, then they zero out the bills. So what that means is they will each have their recommendations and then they basically put it down to a single page where it has one item in it for $100 and they send them back. They do that because every budget needs to be negotiated between the House, Senate, and governor. And this starts that process of conference committees to reconcile the budgets. So once they do that, they will then put all of those bills in conference committee. Each chamber will appoint members to the conference committee. It's generally people that serve on those budget committees. And then you wait for the May revenue estimating conference to come out, which will give updated numbers on what the state revenues are, which will help determine what the budget will actually be. So then once you have those new numbers, you will then actually develop the budget. And that's when sort of the House, Senate, and governor work together to pass budgets. Over the past decade, the budgets have generally been done by June or July, in part to give members the summer off mostly, but also to help both your K-12 schools, and then it also helps higher education and community colleges have their budgets before their fiscal year starts to know how much they will have in appropriations, which impacts sort of their planning for the upcoming year. And then again, the fiscal year ends on September 30th and the new year begins on October 1st. And then one other piece in there, the governor may line item veto in the budget, which means she can sign the budget into law, but then strike out certain provisions within the budget that he or she doesn't agree with. And then that money sort of lapses back to the state fund, and then it is available for expenditure in a future budget. Oversight, I'm not going to go into this really that much, but know that the legislature is the main oversight body for state government. They have a joint committee on administrative rules, which is oversight for the department's rulemaking authority. The Senate does advice and consent for gubernatorial appointments. They also can approve or disapprove any executive reorganization, which we saw when Governor Whitmer came in and created a new environmental department. She changed the old one and created a new one. And then they have other tools within their power to do things like they can put sunsets on laws, they can do investigations. They work with the Auditor General and ombudsmen to do regular checks on departments and sort of, the work that they are doing and if they're in compliance with statute. Constituent representation, again, not a big piece for us, but to know that is the main thing most offices deal with from a day-to-day basis. They will have constituent calls from everything from unemployment issues to changes they want in bills to, sort of everything under the sun. Most offices, that's mostly what they deal with. In fact, to put it into perspective, every legislator is limited in how many bills they can introduce each month. It's 6 requests that they can make and introduce in a month, yet they sort of are filled with constituent outreach of, the thousands per month. So that is a big piece of what each office does. And I would note that as you work to advocate for policy, the first person you're ever going to come in contact with in an office is the person that does the constituent representation. They're generally called in Lansing the front desk person, that is the person you will have to connect with, get to know, and work on getting on the schedule for a legislator to advocate for a piece of legislation. And then here I just have a couple examples that I thought were interesting for discussion to just sort of see what different policy can look like. So I picked out from 2021, the current legislative term, there were 4 public acts, Public Acts 134, 136, 137, and 143. Collectively, it's the SOAR package, that is the Strategic Outreach and Attraction Reserve Fund, the Critical Industry Program, the Strategic Readiness Program, and then there was a separate bill there that limited state ad board transfer powers. The fund that was set up was, let me see if I can get this to open. Okay, so this is one of the bills within that package. And this was an economic development program sort of led by the governor and then approved by the House and Senate. And so this is the legislative website. I won't click on the bill to show you through. There were sort of other pieces I wanted to show here, but with each bill, you can search the bill either by sponsor, by category, by section amended, and then you'll see each version. So there was a Senate introduced version, then it passed the Senate, passed the House. It was amended in the House, which meant there was a Senate concurred version, and then there was a public act. Then you can see the fiscal analyses from both the agencies. And then down here, you can also see all of the action that was on the bill. So it gives you sort of a history of the bill. The one I wanted to note was the one that amended the State Administrative Board, which I think is this one. Nope. This one. This is interesting because the genesis behind this bill was the governor really wanted to do this economic development package. She wanted to do business attraction. She thought that was important both for the state and probably for her reelection prospects. The legislature was very frustrated with the governor's use of the state ad board back in the early years of her term. So for background, the legislature passed a budget bill with the governor. She then used the state ad board to move things between budgets and sort of did not follow what was in the bill, but then used her ad board transfer powers to move things within other budgets to the tune of something like almost $1 billion was moved around the budget into other departments that the governor thought that she wanted to use. That then was a fight for about 3 years with the legislature of her overstepping her bounds and recognizing that this was the only opportunity they had to leverage more control on the state ad board. They then added this bill as part of the package to limit her abilities to use the state ad board in that way while giving her something she wanted. And so I'm going to click on the bill here. And then I'm not going to go through the bill, but at the bottom, you will see it has an enacting section, which says it does not go into effect unless all of these bills are signed. And each of these bills will have that at the end. And what that is tying all of these bills together so that it couldn't be a thing where the governor signed the 3 economic development bills, but then didn't sign this bill. So the only way everything happened was if all 4 bills were signed. And while I have this open, I'll show you one thing. Another thing about Michigan that is different from Congress is Michigan, it has to be on the same subject. So you'll always hear in Congress, oh, they passed a bill for, I don't know, water, and somehow it had something tied to, housing, and then it had something tied to, defense spending, and there's all these random things tied to it. You can't do that in Michigan. Michigan is a single subject state, so the bill has to be germane to one subject when you're passing it. You can't tie a bunch of different bills in together. And then when you draft a bill, it's either a single section or a multi-section bill, which then limits what you can do. So in a multi-section bill, if the act has 500 sections and say you're only amending 2 and you make it a multi-section, you can now amend any of those 500 sections. If it's a single section bill, you can only amend that one section of the bill and nothing else. So in this bill, at the top where it says amending section 3 as amended by PA 161 of 2019. That means they could only amend this section and it limited what they could do. So that means people couldn't offer amendments to other parts of this or make this expand beyond what their goal was, which was making it a one section bill that limited the governor's powers as it relates to administrative board transfers. So I'm going to stop sharing that. And then I'm going to put this back up. So that was the 4 policy bills. And then now there is also a public act, a supplemental appropriation bill that provided funding for this program. So those 4 bills at the top were the policy bills that created the statute. And then Public Act 132 put $1 billion into this reserve fund that was then available for economic development projects. I won't click on that piece for you. I'll let you check that out on your own. But then the next 2 I wanted to show you, which was the legislative transfer. So part of this process was the governor wanted to be more nimble in her economic development approach, but the legislature didn't want to just give the governor $1 billion blank check to do whatever she wanted with the funds. So they created a legislative transfer process in which the governor would have to send a letter to the legislature. And so this is the letter from the governor requesting at this time $666 million to do an economic development project with General Motors. And so this came to the legislature about how they wanted to use the funds, what 2 different funds that the dollars would go into, and how they were partnering with a township around the Lansing area. And then this went before both the House and Senate Appropriations Committee for evaluation, in which they talked to the Michigan Economic Development Corporation, they talked to industry stakeholder groups, General Motors, the townships, and then considered the bill before them. And unlike a regular bill that needs to go for a vote of the legislature, this just needed to be approved by the 2 committees, which by a simple majority, which is, half plus 1 of the members in each chamber. And then this is the letter, which ultimately, after 2 hearings, the legislature then sent a letter from former chairman Thomas Albert and Senator Jim Stamas approving the transfer, and then transferred the funds over to the MEDC to then appropriate those funds out to General Motors for its economic development project. I apologize for keep going off because I don't know how to go between screen shares. And then the last one I have here is the mental health professionals. And I thought this one was interesting because Wayne State School of Social Work was actually engaged on this. Their Center for Behavioral Health and Justice would be a beneficiary of this, and then it also impacts licensure in the state. And so this is an example. Again, I won't open it up, but within these bills, when I send it around, you will see there are things both. It's a multi-section bill, so it's amending current statute. They then went in and did cleanup, which is interesting. So the cleanup is when the section was amended last year, they said this will go into effect within 90 days of the amendatory act. Now that that is passed, they went in and actually, from a process standpoint, updated it to a date certain, so everyone knows when the program went into effect. It has effective enacting date in which it goes into effect for a certain amount of time and that is no longer enacted. And Bill 37 and 38, or Public Acts 37 and 38, are tie-barred together, which is the loan repayment program for mental health professionals that seek licensure. And then 180 is a mental health program that was established for K-12 schools. And this is one where the bills are not tie-barred together, but they are a policy package that is together from a legislative perspective. So all of these bills went at the same time, were considered one package, even though they aren't technically one package. And again, like the previous one, this one also has funding tied to it. So in here you'll have the most recent appropriations bill, which has funding for this program. And then what I have here is the Public Act, and then I have the original House passed bill for Section 31AA. What I wanted to do was show you sort of how the process happens. So when you look at Section 31AA of the House passed bill 5795, that section was specific just to this mental health program called SMART, in which there was $15 million appropriated as part of this program for mental health professional loan repayment and establishing the program in K-12 schools. And then after Section 31AA, there were 4 or 5 other different items of mental health funding. And then as the budget was being negotiated, there was a sort of conversation on, does it make sense to enumerate how the schools are supposed to spend these dollars? Or do we just give them a large pot of money and make all of these programs eligible? Because there were about 10 or so different programs that were seeking mental health funding within schools. The conclusion was, let's give them the $150 million for mental health funding, which will then go out to the schools on like a per student basis. And then each school can determine how best to use the funding. So initially when this passed, there was concern that, oh, we put all this effort into creating the SMART program and it went from being funded to not funding. And instead it went from, it's still funded, but now you kind of have to do a little bit more work and work with different school districts to ensure that the school district wants to employ this program moving forward. And that's sort of an example of, again, when you get into the negotiations, you sort of, things adjust rapidly. And then it's also sort of a flaw in the system in that because the negotiations happen at the top between the Senate, the House, and the governor, the sort of stakeholders fall off at times, and it creates confusion, which then requires either sometimes cleanup later, and that leads to, you'll see a lot of legislation is cleanup, but it also then leads to, again, confusion in that you have to then re-educate stakeholders on what the final product was, because there is confusion on what was originally passed and what ultimately was the final thing that was passed and enacted into law. So again, that's an overview of sort of what the legislature is and a couple examples of some of those bills. It doesn't go into advocacy and what is good advocacy. I thought that would be better saved for a later conversation, but I guess I'll open it up to questions and then we can sort of go from there.
Thank you so much, Dave. Yeah, if anyone has any questions, feel free to unmute yourselves or drop them in the chat and we will read them to the group.
I actually had a question, but it was an advocacy-based question. Is that okay to ask?
Yeah.
Okay, so there is a bill that we've been interested in, and it was introduced by Senator McMurrow in April of 2021. And in a meeting with her, she had mentioned that she was waiting for a hearing. So my question is there anything that we're able to do on our end when a bill is not moving along?
Yes, I think that's one of those ones where outreach to the chair's office is helpful. I would say the difference between good advocacy and bad advocacy is knowing how to reach out to an office too. Sometimes mass emails works, and sometimes it's actually creates a deterrent. So I would say, like, on an issue like this, more individualized outreach, try to figure out if we're working with the chairperson, do we have a way in to talk to this chairperson to have a meaningful conversation on why we should have a hearing? There might be other issues. One that always comes to mind is a local government issue. If there's an issue that impacts townships, cities, or villages, the best approach always is like have everyone email, and members generally get nervous when if they represent 17 townships and all 17 reach out and say, can you have a hearing on this? They'll have a hearing. But on bills that likely won't, so this is a bill that wouldn't move because Senator McMurrow is in the minority. And it's probably, I don't know what the bill does, I'd have to pull it up. It's either a bill where it won't move because it's politically divisive, or two, it might be a good policy bill, but they don't want to give a bill to a member in the minority that could get to the governor's office. So they'll then work with a member of their own caucus to sponsor the bill and move it forward, or work with someone in the other chamber. Obviously, Senator McMurrow, now in leadership for next term, was clearly a controversial figure with the existing leadership in the Senate. So it was never likely, right, that she would have bills moved just because of her role in the legislature currently.
Okay, thank you.
And I would say too, I guess one last thing I would add is recognizing that you could still have issues with the change of terms where bills might not move, but you'll also on certain bills have a more friendly audience. And then again, that is an opportunity to take advantage of sort of the more friendly audience that you have and push probably more aggressively than you would if you're confronting someone that is sort of opposed to the bill or what the policy is trying to do. So I saw the next question is what percentage of bills are legitimately written by politicians versus provided by lobbyists? That's hard to say, I guess, to estimate. I would sort of reframe that question too, in that the lobbyist is not necessarily an adversary or a bad thing for the lawmaking process. So like technically I'm a lobbyist for Wayne State. And so when I'm going to advocate for funding for Wayne State, that doesn't mean it's inherently an issue because Wayne State wants additional funding for the institution, or that a politician is necessarily, writing policy for the best, ends possible. It could be a political statement in and of itself. I guess I'll reframe it in what policy is sort of developed for actual movement, which is what is developed for political statements. And I would say most policy, probably north of 75%, is policy that people legitimately want to see move generally for the betterment of their cause or their issue, with most pieces of legislation passing with broad support on both sides. If you look, the legislature this year, I can pull it up, probably passed in this term, this 2-year term, over 500 pieces of legislation, of which, 90+% is probably has 90+ votes, 90% support from both chambers. There's very few issues that are political, that are sort of divisive in nature or are sort of working against the need. A lot of policy that you see is very technical in nature, things that just need to be updated or need to be adjusted based on sort of changes in what, things that are going on federally or locally or otherwise.
Thanks so much, Dave. Were there any other questions from the group? Or Katie, I know some people dropped off. Did they maybe send you any questions?
I think both of them asked their questions, so we're good on my end.
Awesome. I guess I had a question for you, Dave. You mentioned at the end that sort of towards the end of in certain cases, stakeholders' voices are sort of lost and it requires that cleanup process. Is that something that you think is, I guess, an oversight by nature of like the system of state government, or is that something that you see a potential fix for?
Yeah, I think, I guess the best way I can put it is democracy is not meant to be efficient, but people want an efficient democracy. And that's where the problems arise. I think people get upset when they say, why is it taking 7 months for this bill to move? Well, probably because you need 7 months worth of work to work with stakeholders. Unfortunately, due to the political nature of state legislature or other. Thanks, Mike. Due to the political nature of the legislature, at times things need to move more quickly, and then people sort of remove stakeholders from the process. I would say the best pieces of legislation keep those stakeholders engaged throughout the process so that you avoid that. But there are also instances, so I came from working on the budget, and we actually signed an agreement between the Senate Appropriations Chair, the House Appropriations Chair, and the State Budget Director, and then about 4 or 5 staff, that we were not allowed to talk to anyone outside of people in that room for the sake of confidentiality as we were negotiating, because in those instances, you don't want to go and say, hey, the admin doesn't want to support proposal X that they keep telling you publicly they support, but they're not. And then it creates like a groundswell of issues, and then that undermines sort of the negotiation process. So in some instances, you have those situations where you're purposely keeping stakeholders out so that you can reach a consensus. But then sometimes that consensus results in issues that need to be cleaned up later. I think generally when that happens, though, there is general agreement to fix those things, recognizing that there was a specific, reason for keeping them excluded during that process, and knowing you will need other people to engage later in the process.
Great. Thanks, Dave. I think we got one more question in the chat from Maggie. She asked, is there anywhere else online you like to get your news about the new acts or legislature for the state, or is it mainly that Michigan legislature website that we saw earlier?
So yeah, you can use Gongwer. I don't know if they have a free service for students. I'll type it in the chat. But from there, you can sign up. You can have an account, and you can tag subjects or items that you want to receive when there's bills introduced, and it'll automatically populate like an Excel for you so that you can track legislation for issues of interest. But generally what I do is since I work closely with the legislature, every time a bill is introduced and referred, I automatically receive a report from the House and Senate staff that lets me know what bill was introduced and what committee it was referred to. And then I'll go through that list to be able to check, does it impact, Wayne State or not? Does it impact a stakeholder we work with? And then it'll go in like our own tracking document. But the Michigan legislature website is probably the best website for tracking legislation or looking up legislation. And I could work on putting together a sort of, I don't want to present on it, but a PowerPoint or some sort of document that shows you how to navigate that website. Because it can be intuitive and then very unintuitive at times, but there is everything on there from Michigan journals to bills that are introduced to public acts to rules to committee postings to members information, that you can get everything you need from that one website.
Yeah, that sounds like something that could be really useful to some folks. So if you'd be able to set something like that up, we would really appreciate it.
Yeah. I think it might be
awesome.
helpful. And I could also see too, it might be really interesting. So that website is run by Legislative Council. I could see if they would be willing to present on how to use that website. They will generally do that for new staff and new members. So that is an option. And as Mike found earlier, I won an engagement ring and got married to a woman named Shanda. If you look up Legislative Council, my wife Shanda actually works at Legislative Council, so I could help make setting up that probably pretty possible.
That would be amazing. That sounds like a really great connection if we could have that. Awesome. Well, yeah, I didn't see any more questions in the chat. I think folks, if there are any remaining, you could maybe chime in, but otherwise, if you think of any questions later on, you're welcome to send them to us at our email at scipoldetroit@wayne.edu, and we can keep them in mind for the next sort of workshop that we have with Dave. Or Dave, I don't know if you're available, if folks have questions, to send them directly to you.
Yep, I'm always available. My email, I'll put it in the chat, is feel free to reach out to me. I will respond. I enjoy this stuff. And I didn't want to scare anyone off from advocacy or policy. I just thought it would be best to start here. So if you guys want to talk advocacy right now or have questions, I'm willing to sort of start going down that road. My personal belief was I thought it would be more effective to sort of talk about advocacy from a specific policy, because then it has more of a real impact in what you are trying to do. Because general talking about advocacy isn't as effective if you don't know what the policy is, who you need to talk to, what the other stakeholders might say. That then provides a more fuller, enlightening conversation.
Absolutely. No, I think this was a wonderful place to start. I know someone said it in the chat, but just even a refresher for some of us, or I definitely learned a lot of new things that will help us moving forward when we have more of these conversations. So I know for now, we only have about a minute left in the scheduled time that we set for today. So I want to be conscious of everybody's time, but I think moving forward, the next conversation that we have with you, Dave, will probably be centered around advocacy in the way that you just described. I think that would be really valuable for everyone here.
Sounds good. I look
So-
forward to it.
Yeah, we will certainly be sending more information about that out once we have a date set. Likely next semester. We don't think we'll get anything set up now before the next holiday season, but we really appreciate your time, Dave. This has been so valuable. And please, everyone, look out for, we'll share the PowerPoint and the recording from this meeting. Okay.
See ya.
Well, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your Monday.
Thank you.